Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. I must say that photograph was AI generated. I don't really look like that. Folks, my name is Bongani Bingwa, and it really is my great pleasure to officially open today's proceedings. I am going to be your host for most of the day. In my normal job, I'm a broadcast journalist based in Johannesburg. For many years, I've worked in investigative television news, and of course, I host a morning radio program of current affairs. I give you that information, particularly, of course, for those of you who are not based in South Africa, also to let you know that the thrill for me to be here this morning is looking around this room, not only, of course, at the leadership of Standard Bank, but so many of you who are clients of the bank, who represent the real engine of African economic growth, because behind each of your faces are stories of boldness, stories of imagination, stories of employment, stories of our future. And for someone like me, who often hears only the bad news, who often only tells the bad news, it really is exciting to temper that perspective with all of your successes. So thank you very much for allowing me the privilege to join you here, because as I leave, I expect I'll have a good story to tell. So welcome to Africa Unlocked, Unlocking Africa's Growth, the Standard Bank Business and Commercial Banking Conference. And I think it's important to underscore from Standard Bank's perspective that this isn't a conference that's going to focus just on South Africa, or even South Africa at all, really. But really, it's rather about showing the commitment of the bank to the continent, as evidenced by its presence in 21 jurisdictions and territories. And whilst much of the conversation on the story of Africa's potential is often focused on its endowment with natural resources, what is often missed, perhaps, is a focus on its most important resource, its people. Well, not any longer. Because from its demographic dividend to rapid urbanization, the opportunities, as you well know, are boundless. We need investment in human capital, regional integration, economic diversification, the digital revolution. These are just some of the conversation topics we are going to touch on, from energy to agriculture, investment, and growth. This is Africa's century, and as they say, the time is now. But before we begin, perhaps let's just go through some house rules, formalities, if you will. Please may I request that all our phones be put on silent, particularly, of course, as a courtesy to all those who will be presenting on stage. I'll just give you a moment to do that. Your interest just went up. All right, the bathrooms are clearly demarcated as you exit this main room to the left on the side, so essentially parallel to where I am, but you're going to have to walk around the room to get to them. That's where the bathrooms are. We have 2 meeting rooms for most of the day. This will be, let's call this session room 1. And just across from where I am will be session room 2. Some of the panels, as you will know from the program, will be split, so you'll have a choice either to stay here or to just go across. But most of the day will be held in here. And if you haven't yet logged in, we do have Wi-Fi available. Simply choose the Standard Bank Wi-Fi, and the password is small caps Africa Unlocked as one word. Now, this is a very important announcement. In case of emergency, I'm going to ask everyone to remain seated. You'll allow me a chance to get out. As you can appreciate, we've got the top leadership of the bank in the room, so we've taken all contingency measures. We've got paramedics on scene, and we've also got a very well-trained protection team available, so nothing will go wrong, but if it does, we'll certainly follow the instructions as we are given at the time. Without any further ado then, let's get things started, shall we? It's time now for the opening address by Bill Blackie, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Business and Commercial Banking at Standard Bank Group. Please join me in welcoming Bill on stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Bongani. Let me start by welcoming you all to the inaugural Business and Commercial Banking Client Conference at this breathtaking Norval Foundation. You know, we really do greatly appreciate the time that you've committed to us, particularly the long distance you've had to travel in the context of this weather that we're facing in the Cape this week. But I guess if the World Economic Forum can build a proposition in the little town of Davos in the middle of the Swiss winter, we can manage a little bit of Cape rain in the mother city. I remember as a small boy in Harare being told that rain is a great blessing in Africa, and so I guess we are being blessed today. For those of you that might be staying on after this conference, I can assure you that the sun will come out and the weather will improve. And from that statement, you may take that I'm an optimist. I know for all entrepreneurs that you are optimists too. And so I thought it'd be good to talk about this opportunity of optimism today. Optimism is such a powerful force for change, such a force for growth and unlocking opportunity. It is multidimensional. There's some science to it, but of course there's some art to it. So continuing from where we left off at the Zeitsmarker last night, let me begin with the art. As Africans, we really are optimists. It reflects in our art not just at this Norval Foundation, but in the work of some of our musicians. So if I can draw from the song of the late Tsepo Tsola, it was called Nonyana. Nonyana is the Sesotho word for a bird. And Tsepo tells us the story of a farmer lamenting the destruction of his crops by birds. But yet in the song, he manages to remind us that as Africans, we're optimistic and that we can find joy despite the circumstances. But of course, as Bongani said, there's science and optimism too. There's so many data points to be positive about Africa and its future. But to pick just a few, we look at the pace of GDP growth in sub-Saharan Africa. We look at Africa, which is home to the world's youngest and fastest growing population. That will bring with it opportunities for robust, inclusive growth. That will allow the exploitation of natural resources and the abundant human capital, benefiting both Africa and the world. Importantly, particularly for a forum like this, it's the growing structural shift, that balance between the agricultural and extractive industries that we've relied on and the growth into manufacturing, services, and trade sectors. But you know, neither art nor science will suggest that unlocking growth is straightforward or easily achieved. And so, in the context of Standard Bank, in our entire corporate life, we have been optimistic. Right from the early days of the support of the wool trade 165 years ago, to the opening of the diamond and gold fields that led to the transition of South Africa from a largely agrarian economy to an industrial economy, and to more modern times when the bank has had the courage to build an Africa-wide franchise. We've always been and always will be positive and optimistic. On that note, from Standard Bank's perspective, we were pleased to be joined today not just by the Business and Commercial Banking leadership team, but also by our chairman, our group chairman, Yinka Nyembezi, Sim Chabalala, our Group Chief Executive Officer, Lungisa Fuzile, the Chief Executive Officer of the Standard Bank of South Africa, Yinka Sanni, the Chief Executive Officer of the Africa franchise, Sharon Taylor, our Group Head of People and Culture, and Adom, our Group Strategy Officer, and our Group Chief Economist, Goolam Ballim. We say that as a group we're client-led, and so I hope that the seniority of this delegation at this conference, we indicate to you, both at a group and a personal level, the commitment to understand your business better. If we understand your business better, we can serve you better and so grow alongside you. As we embark on this journey over the next few days and we explore the theme of unlocking Africa's growth, our discussions will not only highlight the opportunities that lie within the continent, but also the new partnerships and collaborations that we can drive for collective success. We've designed a format that allows the sharing of the knowledge and the wisdom that we have in this room. We're going to cover topics like Africa's competitive advantage, growing together in a fragmented world, Africa's energy solutions, trading as one, building of family businesses, how Africa can feed itself, amongst others. But importantly, what we've done is also set aside time to allow mingling and sharing. As our chairman said so eloquently in an opening address last night, when entrepreneurs from different sectors, regions, and backgrounds come together, they exchange ideas, collaborate on solutions, and inspire each other. It's these interactions that lead to groundbreaking innovations that both address challenges and create new markets. So please also relax and enjoy yourself in this fabulous setting. Amongst you are entrepreneurs from West Africa, from East Africa, from SADC, and from South Africa. Some of you represent very large, well-established companies, and some of you represent startups. Amongst you are specialists in mining services, primary and secondary agriculture, energy, renewable energy, transport, trade, retail, property, technology, FMCG. I could go on. The key points are twofold. The first is that there's a huge amount of collective skill and wisdom and capability in this room. And the second is to acknowledge that you are the ones unlocking the opportunity from possibility. Not in an academic sense, but in a brilliant, get your hands dirty and make things happen sense. Coming back to the bank, just over 5 years ago, at a time when the banking world was consolidating, digitizing, de-staffing all of their banking operations, SIM and the group board took the extremely bold decision to do the opposite. And that was to create a specialist segment that would focus specifically on the needs of small to medium-sized businesses. That choice has paid a handsome dividend for the group. In the words of Charles Russell, our number one rated equities analyst, Standard Bank is now the largest business and commercial banking offering in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's important that I don't share this with you in a boastful sense. What it is to emphasize the commitment that we as a group have in making a difference in Africa. Under SIM's leadership, we've brought ourselves together under the purpose of Africa's our home, we drive her growth. As Sim will share with us later this evening, we believe that beyond what Africa has already achieved, Africa has really significant potential, and we're determined to focus our efforts on unlocking that potential. In this context, while Africa's our home, we drive our growth is a phrase, it's a powerful and inspiring phrase. It's important to know that there's real substance behind this. And so we as a bank have consciously chosen to have physical presence in 20 African countries, to have both local and hard currency capabilities, to have cash capabilities, branch presence, appropriate digital channels to facilitate quick and easy transactions, to have the capability to help our clients to manage their onshore and offshore liquidity requirements, but also to build multi-generational wealth and to preserve that wealth over multi-generations. We've also built the capacity to help clients interact with inter-African trade channels, European trade channels, Asian trade channels, and American trade channels. And extremely importantly, we've made the conscious decision to have highly skilled relationship managers, because at the end of the day, business is done between people. We'll hear later in the program from Dr. Leila Fourie, the CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. She will share her very compelling vision, both for capital markets in Africa. Those are both laudable and aspirational goals that she set. But as a bank, we also know that we have to build a real meat and potatoes capability. There's a huge gap between the capital that friends and family can bring together to kickstart businesses and the equity of debt and equity debt capital markets of Africa. As banks in Africa, we will for a long time be the primary intermediators between borrowers and lenders, stimulating growth in small to medium enterprises. But what we know is in the world's largest and most stable and most robust economies, they are well endowed with small, medium, and large family-owned businesses. Which perhaps brings me to the most important point, is that as a bank, we are just an intermediator, an important intermediator, but just an intermediator. It is you, the entrepreneurs in our society, that see the gaps, connect the dots, venture where others fear to tread, and ultimately unlock the opportunity that Africa represents and turn that into tangible possibility. In that context, the theme of the conference is unlocking Africa's growth. It's not just a slogan. It genuinely is a call to action to unlock the full potential of our vibrant economy. So I look forward to spending the next few days with you, learn more about your businesses, and I hope that you can learn more about one another. On that note, thank you again. Enjoy the abundance of Africa's blessings today. Thank you. Bongani.
Thank you, Bill, for setting the scene. And I think one of the important aspects of the day is obviously to really invite all of us to take the opportunity to network as furiously as possible. And who knows what opportunities may arise even from those conversations. And now for the welcome address by Lungisa Fuzile, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Standard Bank, South Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bongani Bingwa, our program director. Some of us fondly call him Ballim. Our chairman, Ms. Nyembezi, Group CE, Mr. Sim Chabalala, and all of my colleagues present here, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Mine is a simple task. It is to say you are welcome. But it got complicated once the weather changed. It is a singular honor and a privilege for me to welcome you all to the inaugural Business and Commercial Banking Conference, so aptly themed, Unlocking Africa's Growth. I say the conference is aptly themed because our group's purpose, as Bill was saying, is Africa is our home. We drive her growth. So this conference is about our group living its purpose. This year, we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And we recognize the critical role that Africa plays in shaping a sustainable and inclusive future. Gathered here today are high-ranking government officials, distinguished partners, renowned thought leaders, and key clients of our group from across the continent who have traveled from everywhere to be part of this auspicious occasion. We open our arms to welcome you all to our shores. We do not take your support and loyalty for granted. Admittedly, as Bill was pointing out, the weather is not great, but such is the weather in Cape Town in winter. Hopefully we'll schedule the conference either in a different province or at a different time, if we'll have it in Cape Town. Over the next 2 days, we will discuss and deliberate Africa's vast potential and the dynamic trends shaping its future. We have curated a program that includes thought-provoking sessions on Africa's competitive advantage, in finding growth opportunities, advancements in trade, harnessing Africa's renewable energy potential, as well as exploring ways to navigate the unique challenges and opportunities facing business across the continent. It is an exceptional program and a lineup of participants, even if I have to say so myself. Guided by Africa's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the and African Union's Agenda 2063, we must harness trade and industrialization to advance sustainable, inclusive growth. The AfCFTA is set to be one of the engines that will propel this growth by fostering more regional integration and unlocking Africa's potential. Africa is home to significant reserves of minerals essential for the low-carbon technologies driving the global energy transition. Resources such as cobalt, manganese, copper, and lithium are not only vital for our planet's future, but also represent massive economic opportunities for our nations. Our continent holds about 55% of world's cobalt reserves, about 47% of manganese, and a large share of other critical minerals. These deposits can generate revenues, create jobs, and raise living standards across the continent. They need partnerships amongst us to realize this. Our continent has a huge infrastructure deficit. Many of our countries can barely meet their energy needs, if at all. For us, this is an opportunity. We draw inspiration from the wise and courageous words of Anthony Robbins when he says, and I quote him, "Every problem is a gift. Without problems, we wouldn't grow," unquote. Africa's renewable energy potential is immense. Some of the biggest wind farms are on this continent, like the Lake Turkana wind power project in Kenya. So, from solar to wind, our continent can lead the charge towards a sustainable energy landscape. Countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, and Zambia have been investing in hydropower projects, taking advantage of their abundant water resources. We need to collaborate, invest, and build the infrastructure needed to power homes, industries, and cities with clean energy. So, yes, there are challenges that we need to overcome, but there is also reason to be optimistic about the future of our continent, as Bill was pointing out. A recent study published by the World Economic Forum suggests that Africa could achieve 76% renewable energy by 2040 through a combination of hydropower, solar, and wind energy. Collaborative approaches among countries are essential to achieve this ambitious goal, though. As Africa's largest bank by assets, we stand ready to unleash every capability we have as we partner you in unlocking the growth potential of our continent. We humbly but fervently believe that Standard Bank has what it takes to make a meaningful contribution in driving Africa's rise in the decades ahead. Not only do we have the largest balance sheet, but we also have a footprint in 20 countries on the continent, diverse products, and the right orientation to achieve this ambition. We are committed to growing businesses by providing relevant and targeted products and solutions. Our group recognizes the importance of this business segment that has gathered us here today in building and growing economies. We are committed to supporting you with innovative and affordable products and services that meet every unique need. As we discuss how to take advantage of the opportunities the continent offers, I implore you to be deliberate about integrating small and medium-sized businesses into your supply chains and to foster an enabling environment for entrepreneurship. To conclude, Africa stands tall on the global stage as a beacon of opportunity and hope. Our continent is rich in resources and brimming with promise. Together, we can unlock Africa's massive potential and shape a better future. As we are engaging over the next 2 days, let us always remember, Africa banks on business. Business banks on us. I wish you fruitful deliberations over the next 2 days. I join Bill in saying that you should take time to do sightseeing, but selfishly, I invite you to do some shopping and swipe those cards like mad. I've got targets to meet. Thank you very much.
I take it, Mhlegazi, you don't miss your old job in these interesting political times. Now, what to do with 1.2 billion people, a combined gross domestic product of over $2 trillion US, an abundance of natural resources, the most fertile arable land anywhere in the world. Our next session is Africa's competitive advantage, finding the growth opportunities. And as you've heard, we want to explore the unique strengths, the emerging trends, and strategic insights that position our continent as a key player in global markets. We're going to be hearing from Standard Bank Group Economist Goolam Ballim, and that'll be followed by a panel discussion, and of course, we'll invite some of your questions. So without any further ado, Goolam.
Good morning. In my time at Standard Bank, I've learned that there's two types of people: non-performing loans and performing loans. I'd like to welcome the latter to this morning's assembly. It's good to have you. Forgive my rather lame attempt at the late James Earl Jones. This is not illness, just strained vocal cords. It's been an abundance of client engagements in recent weeks, in part. And in part, some pays me per word spoken. I'm delighted it isn't any sensible word spoken, because then he wouldn't pay me much. Lungisa, I think this is ideal weather. If it were balmy outside, I suspect half the audience would be at the nearby Muizenberg beach. So the timing is perfect and the weather is suitable. I've been tasked with perhaps setting the scene with respect to the African landscape. I won't take too much time, and in fact I may appear a little bit glib at certain moments, only because of time constraints. But I'm also comfortable that many of the perhaps hot-button themes that I will surface will be engaged in the ensuing hours over the next day and a half. So I'm comfortable that they will be fleshed out. I've assembled my little bit of theater into 3 installments. First, I want to give you a glimpse of the continent, perhaps in a manner in which you've not seen before, or at least I hope so. Second, I want to talk about some of the, what we economists would call structural changes, seismic changes that are enveloping the globe. We're of the opinion that we're not just, in the aftermath of COVID, attaching cyclically to the themes and times that prevailed prior to COVID, we believe we are on the cusp of a new epoch, a new era in many ways. And then the third installment is simply to talk about Africa's cyclical conditions, how we think about growth over the near to medium term. Africa and its more charming disposition. This gives you a glimpse of Africa in terms of its population density. Where are Africans distributed? You will notice that it appears for the most part to be somewhat of an arc, somewhat of a boomerang. The mass of Africans concentrated from Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, heading east, just beyond Nigeria, a little bit of thinness, and then from the eastern shores, the northeastern shores, all the way down to the northeastern parts of South Africa. This is the concentration of Africans. And of course, across the Sahara, Sahara being Arabic for desert, quite shallow, largely, of course, the Sahara being the world's largest hot desert. It ranks third in terms of size of desert. I mean, the Sahara is about 9 million square kilometers, all the way from the Red Sea in the east to the Atlantic Ocean on the other end, around 9 million square kilometers of dryness, of cloudlessness, and of course, therefore, a great source of thermal opportunity. And of course, a great sprinkling of people, almost like a halo, in North Africa. And of course, this also suggests we tend to gravitate towards bodies of water. And if you look at the Nile, I mean, it's probably the most dense zone across the continent. If we look at rainfall, you will note that there's an abundance of rainfall, which is the darker shaded area, kind of again from Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, not so much as we get to Ghana, plentiful in Cameroon and all the way through the DRC. But notice also the relatively dry arc of rainfall happens to also be where humanity is distributed across the continents. In other words, even though we gravitate to bodies of water, many Africans seem to be distributed in the more drier areas of the continent. And there's a subtlety in this. It suggests that while agriculture is a significant contributor to GDP and also to income dependency, in many nations, more than 40% of Africans, or at least citizens, are dependent on agriculture for income, for subsistence. Yet, this image suggests there's a precariousness with regard to rainfall. And if you consider that more than 80% of African agriculture is rainfall dependent rather than irrigation dependent, it speaks to the vulnerability. But it also speaks to the opportunity to irrigate and to then introduce more steady state and predictable production. But again, that arc in terms of drier conditions is notable. This is African forest, and of course, it mimics the rainfall opportunity. The more dense forest, which is the lighter areas on this particular exhibit, where it rains more abundantly, and comparatively less forest area in areas where people are situated. But it also speaks to this notion that Africa also offers the world a second lung, in addition, of course, to the Brazilian and the Amazon forests. These are croplands. We farm where we reside, and where we reside, somewhat lesser water in terms of rainfall. Livestock density, again, where we reside, and you can see the denseness in terms of West Africa into Ethiopia, and then down south through Central Africa. A slightly different arc emerges when we look at shipping lines, an abundance of traffic along the southern coast, the Cape of Storms. And of course, you can see north the Suez, Arabian, Red Sea channel, very significant in terms of shipping lines. I would argue that it's unlikely we're going to see a material increase in shipping traffic around the Horn of Africa. If a ship were to leave the United Kingdom, say heading to Mumbai, that's a distance of roughly 12,000 kilometers journeyed by ship in about 17 days. Traveling around the Horn of Africa takes about a month. And of course, that's about 20,000 kilometers. However, within tourism, in the first quarter of this year, not just in South Africa, but along the coast, we've seen a record number of tourist ships visit our shores. So I think we'll still continue to cling to around 3% of seaborne traffic. But in terms of tourism, there's an enormity of opportunity. And while I don't celebrate the frictions in Europe and the Middle East, tourists are, of course, now somewhat averse to traveling to those zones. This is at least our carbon footprint. And of course, you can see the Nile, quite intense because of the population density. You can see Lagos, Kano, you can see Johannesburg, Gauteng more broadly, South Africa's coast, Nairobi sticks out, Antananarivo, for example, in Madagascar. But again, just to give you some sense of our carbon footprint. So beyond the charm, to address some of the structural shifts I spoke about a little earlier. For the last 30 years, in terms of multilateralism, in terms of geopolitics, we would argue that the world has been relatively calm. We would suggest that it's been a moderate geopolitical environment. Yes, there's been tensions. Sino-US tensions perhaps come to mind as most prominent. However, it was mostly predictable, mostly steady state. Now, however, and if you consider who would have predicted a war on Europe would occur in this century, not big wars, and I don't want to use the word or phrase small wars so as to belittle the tragedy of the loss of life, Russia, Ukraine, and of course the Middle East as well. But there are many more voices in the world now. There are divisions, whether it's so-called East versus West, South-South chords, and how that challenges the established rules-based paradigm, the emergence of big men leading very significant countries, whether it's Trump 2.0, Vladimir Putin, leader for life, Xi Jinping, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or, as we saw not too long ago, Trump of the tropics, Bolsonaro in Brazil. This big men dimension, combined with the rise of populism, and these big men making glamorous, unrealized promises, populist promises to individuals. So a new confrontational geopolitical paradigm. It's not cyclical, it's not near term, it's not fleeting and passing. I think it is going to remain. It's going to involve an elevated level of risk premium embedded in financial markets. And when we think about it, at the minimum, it shows up in interest rates, it shows up in currency volatility. Over the last 30 years, there's been an astonishing level of integration. People mobility, financial capital, trade, and other areas where it's become seemingly a global village. But now there's a retreat. Some people talk about, and I don't like the word too much, and I'm not trying to coin a phrase, globalization. But the levels of integration are seemingly jarring. And just in terms of COVID's impact, supply chains that were synchronized for perfect symmetry now also seem to be shifting towards greater attention for resilience. So from efficiency to resilience and a recalibration of global supply chain. Just as an anecdote, a very significant German car manufacturer was obtaining its electrical harnesses from the Ukraine, by and large, as an alternative supply so as to mitigate against concentration risk with Ukraine. It set up an alternative supply source in Russia. And that didn't end well in terms of the sudden fissure with regard to the supply of electrical harnesses. We're seeing a decided shift in terms of economic activity from the west to the east. This may sound a little bit provocative, but I'm going to suggest, for example, that America bombs and China builds. And I say that because, just by way of reference, America spends on its military as much as the 10 largest spenders, the next 10 largest spenders. China spends on manufacturing as much as the next 9 largest spenders on manufacturing. It's clear where manufacturing capability is going to emerge. We economists tend to talk metaphorically about guns and butter. Spending or investing in guns delivers less long-term economic multiplier. Spending on butter, in the sense a welfare-enhancing item, tends to generate many more fold multiplier in terms of economic growth. China is spending on butter. Elections, we are certainly in this year of an amplified level of elections, and many have delivered surprises. India, Mexico, South Africa, and in many parts of the world, there seems to be this tilt from democratic dispensation to greater levels of illiberalism, greater polarization, diminished levels of pluralism and tolerance. Over the last 30 years, the World Wide Web, or the broader Internet of Things, shaped our lives and amplified economic growth. But the World Wide Web has largely run its course in terms of generating incremental growth. Now it is artificial intelligence, the metaverse, quantum computing, and these forces are structural, and they are an accelerating race into the unknown. It is bringing the future towards us at a compounded pace, and we are going into spaces that we don't know too much about, the so-called unknown unknowns. From dirty energy to clean energy, the greatest energy reset in 100 years. I'm a little cynical sometimes because I would say renewable energy and the lurch there towards is being fashioned by Western nations so as to lend money to African countries to invest in renewable energy, where we will buy the instruments and the tools for renewable energy from Western nations. So when I'm cynical, I sit and I think, well, this is for Europe industrialization 2.0, that they will provide funding to Africa and Africa will pay them and buy the equipment from them. But it's been a little bit skewed because China has quickly overtaken and is now the dominant producer of photovoltaic panels as well as wind turbines. But I'm not going to be cynical today, I'm going to be optimistic. We seem to have shifted from big wars of the last century. And I didn't want to write, again, small wars so as to diminish the loss of life at smaller scale. But frictions, a new Cold War, an elevated level of tensions. If we just look at the conflict in the Middle East, we have not in decades seen this level of public remonstration for matters related to Palestine. Everybody has got a view, and there's been a level of, as I say, public demonstration that is unpalatable. Not unpalatable, if anything, it is palatable, unprecedented. There's also shifts in ideology. In recent years, there seemed to be a shift towards the left, or more greater tolerance for liberal ideas. I'm not making a judgment on wokeism and left-leaning ideology. What I am addressing is there's been some retreat. The more conservative center is somewhat threatened, restless by the shift to wokeism. And if anything, there now seems to be some retreat. The very prevalence and presence of a gentleman like Donald Trump, who addresses that center, that conservative center, is in some respect a function of individuals quietly choosing their political leaders who will elbow that shift to the more extreme left. So even ideology is pivoting. So earlier on when I spoke about a new epoch, we think these are the forces across multiple realms and themes that are coming at us. It's more than just cyclical, and it is more than just technology. Very quickly then, if we look at the last, say, 25 years or so, we can probably talk about African growth through two themes. With the exhibit on the left, what I aim to just show you is that how, at least for the first 15 years or so, performance was generally uniform. Most African countries saw acceleration, and the big nations, in terms of GDP size, outperformed. So as you can see, big in terms of Nigeria, Angola, which kind of feature at that time second after South Africa. And in fact, sub-Saharan Africa's per capita income growth was about 3 times the world average. We were performing better, absolutely and relatively. In the last 15 years, there's been an element of slippage. There's been divergence, some accelerating in terms of GDP per capita, and some slipping. And also in the last 15 years, the bigger nations have been a little bit more tepid in their performance. To break it down into perhaps describing them in a steady state way, in recent years, they have been the consistent growers. And you can see how East Africa jumps out. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, the DRC, even Mozambique. There have been nations that have been recent accelerators. Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire stands out. There have been recent slowdowns, the dark blue. Egypt, Namibia, Zambia, and forgive me, there have also been the slow growers. South Africa, for a length of time, fairly tepid. Nigeria giving up its giddy growth rate from earlier this century to low single digits. I'm only going to touch on one risk now. We'll touch on more later, no doubt. Over-indebtedness. This arc, which has the shape of a smile, but really it's generated a great deal of frown, great deal of debt forgiveness in the early part of the century. Remember the HIPC program, Highly Indebted Poor Country program, which remedied the balance sheets of African countries. And then African countries engaged liberally in absorbing a great deal of debt. Multiple streams of debt, but yeah, I just articulate Chinese loans and the sovereign debt market. And there was a great deal of pickup. And that was okay while growth was strong. Of course, with growth stuttering more recently over the last 10 to 15 years, COVID shock also causing huge displacement, servicing those loans became problematic. And many African countries find themselves over the edge in terms of debt. The good news is perhaps we're retreating from that edge. As you can see, a great deal of surge in Chinese loans in the first 14 years, from about $150 million to more than $80 billion, a really rapid growth rate, more than 50% in compound annual growth rates, and a doubling over the more recent 15 years. But more recently, with the IMF coming and aiding and rescuing many countries' balance sheets, it's been the trigger for debt resolution. It's also been a source of white flag for non-developmental partners, private sector lenders, to re-enter the African markets. From extreme shock, and this just gives you the debt spreads for many African countries, and as you can see, beyond one negative standard deviation. This exhibit just seeks to show you how there's reducing levels of risk perceptions as judged through spreads. In other words, domestic interest rates against US treasuries. Aside from Ethiopia, most African countries that have found themselves in precarious debt positions are reflecting diminished risk as judged through the spreads. To bring my formal part to conclusion, this just gives you a sense of GDP growth rates for this year and next. And I think a few things stands out. East Africa, fairly handsome, but we see some levels of recovery in those slower growing large nations. Nigeria, the reforms seem tractable, and we see them approaching mid-single-digit growth from 2 to 3% in recent years. Angola, another fairly significantly sized nation, 5 years of uninterrupted recession until last year when there was a fleeting level of growth, also beginning to show some level of promise. And there's South Africa as well. And we're optimistic, but we'll give you more color tomorrow on South Africa. Let me stop there with what should have been formal remarks and hand back to Bongani, and I think we have a panel discussion. Bongani.
You've certainly given us food for thought. I'm going to ask you to stick around and just ask the technical team if you would please ensure that we've got chairs on the stage so that our panel can get ready. And whilst the chairs are being put for our guests, let me tell you who our panelists are going to be. We firstly, obviously, Goolam Ballim is going to join us, and no doubt there'll be some pushback on one or two of the points that you've raised. But also, I'm going to invite Dr. Donald Kaberuka, who is the President, African Development Bank, and of course, a special envoy for financing for the African Union. We've also got Yinka Sanni, the Chief Executive Officer for African Regions for the Standard Bank Group. Marvin Adom Armah, the Senior Account Manager at Farmerline, and Priscilla Mabelane, the Chairperson of South Africa's new National Transmission Company. If I can ask all of you, please, to join me on stage. Thank you very much. Perhaps as an opening, I'm going to ask the three of you, I believe Dr. Donald is not able to join us, perhaps just your reflections of what Goolam has just said as an opening salvo. Priscilla, I'll let you go first. Ladies, as they say.
Supposed to be the other way around. Morning, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. It's thought-provoking, but as you said, you're opportunistic. I'm also half glass full, so I see opportunities in the midst of the challenges. I think there's no doubt that our region has gone through some serious challenges that we're faced with, but at the same time, we have abundance of resources, skills, and opportunities for further collaboration. So from where we're sitting in anti-CSA, and from my perspective, the energy sector is one of the biggest opportunities in the region to unlock value. And that will actually implies that we restore, from a South Africa perspective, the economic dilution that we've seen over the last couple of years due to load shedding, but at the same time, accelerate decarbonization. I do understand your challenges around renewables, but we have opportunities to fast track and accelerate and pivot historical outdated technologies to move towards more new technologies. We have opportunities to collaborate. Regional integration becomes more important, not only for sources of supply, but also for innovation, regulation, to be able to leapfrog. So I like the shift towards global to region. But to do that, I think culturally, we need a mindset shift for Africa. We are not necessarily very good in collaboration. We're still very much individualist and thinking about risks and resilience from a unique position of each country. But we don't necessarily see the value of harnessing the entire region. So that would be my comments around what has been said, to say the future is more brighter than we think, and I think it's upon all of us in this room to leave a better legacy for everyone going forward.
Thank you so much. Marvin, I think one of the things we saw from the maps, particularly their reliance and dependence on rainfall versus irrigation, the opportunities, your opening remarks.
Right. Yes, thanks for having me. I actually believe Africa is at the brink of unlocking its potential, especially in agriculture. But one thing that we would need to remind ourselves is if there was anything COVID taught us, it is that technology and agriculture needs to be protected. When you look at what is currently happening on the trends, small-scale farmers heavily depend on rain-fed agriculture irrigation, just as she said. Semi-commercial farmers, however, do have certain basic infrastructure in place, but also get riddled with things such as very extensive cost in terms of managing such resources. And we believe that at this point, technology has a very major role to play in terms of having to bridge that sort of information divide and get farmers to actually then understand what it takes to have irrigation systems to be able to grow all year round. And some of these interventions, as mentioned, are what we currently focus on in terms of making these kind of technologies accessible to farmers, first of all, because it's not just enough to have very good technology. It's not enough to have very sophisticated setups for farmers or in the agricultural space. In the end, it needs to be accessible, and it needs to sort of make impacts on the lives of the farmers. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Yinka. You perhaps more than most in the room, I would say, have a comprehensive understanding of the economic landscape. And given what Goolam just outlined as even the potential in the immediate future, what are your comments?
Thank you very much, Mangani, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please let me welcome our clients from across the continent and from South Africa. Thank you for joining us today at this conference and tomorrow. You are the reason we are the biggest bank in Africa. We appreciate your partnership and the support that we continue to receive from you, and therefore enabling us to drive the growth of Africa. If I would reflect on the introductory remarks that Goolam gave, Africa, yes, there are challenges, but I see opportunities as well. It's a land of huge opportunities, north, west, east, south, and central. It's a land that is resilient. It's a continent of resilience. So despite all the challenges, there are opportunities, and Africa very, very resilient. And it's also a continent of resources, natural resources from the DRC that produces the biggest amount of cobalt, the main resource and input that is needed for cleaner energy, to human resources, with the youngest population, about 60% or so, below the age of 25. So overall, I would think that Africa presents opportunities, it is resilient, and it has huge amount of resources, natural and human.
And I'll pick up on that point of human resources. Goolam, you mentioned a period of relative stability politically, and I would imagine part of that has to start with the implosion of the Soviet Union and the changes that happened in the early 1990s in terms of the globalization period, if you will. One of the things that, as you mentioned about the spending on butter, one might focus on, for China in particular, is creating a dynamic society, educating its people, tapping into that human potential. What lessons can we as a continent learn in the same way?
Bongani, you're precisely correct when you talk about the role of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and also Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and China's early 80s opening up in terms of introducing markets to the global economy. Over the last 30 years or so, there has been this so-called great doubling. By great doubling, what we mean is that the global workforce, since about the early 1990s, doubled. It doubled because China and India, partly Brazil, and some Eastern European nations joined the integrated global workforce. And that meant that production prices could fall. Incomes were earned in more distributed places. and that therefore allowed for scaled production. And it gave tonic to globalization in many other levels. So the point I'm just trying to quickly assert is that simply by lending labor to an economy, it can grow. Because we talk about adding financial capital, human capital, physical capital, and innovation as being the kernel ingredients to stimulate growth. And of course, if that capital, human capital, is more skilled, more greatly commercially endowed, and more modern in its application, it is going to be a buttress for economic growth. And so I think that for Africa, in terms of education levels, which have increased over the last 30 years, have been sustenance and succor for growth. I'll just conclude by saying we're a little concerned that in the aftermath of COVID, where many African children retreated from school, there has not been 100% resubscription. And that's an area where we should be focusing on.
It is an area of concern, but Marvin, perhaps one can overthink this quite a bit. And I'm keen for you to share some of your examples in terms of the work Farmerline is doing in Ghana and helping farmers to become entrepreneurs. The idea, in other words, of starting where the people are.
Right, okay, thanks for that. Farmerline has always had its vision set on one thing, that is to create lasting profits for farmers on the continent and globally. Understanding this assignment, we needed to have started from a point where we understood exactly what riddled farmers on the continent. And in so doing, we are looking at access to quality inputs, assets, and also having information also readily available. Over the past 11 years, working with smallholder farmers, what we've come to understand is that it is important to always start from a point where farmers, first of all, can understand information that you are putting across. So we started off as a company that gave information out to farmers in a form of local content. We pre-record these messages, and these can be in the form of smart agronomic practices, things on climate change, or even in terms of mitigation or being resilient, so to speak. But as the years went by, we understood that there was a need for reinvention, so to speak, and it was important because we understood the trends, how it got increasingly difficult to even get messages out to farmers in areas where there was little or no connectivity. So when it came to the interventions that we started, the first thing is that we needed to first of all understand what technology had to play. So the core functionality of what we actually give is backed by technology, and that is for merge data, which happens to be our proprietary software, which is a web and a mobile application, which is used by government institutions, social enterprises, as well as agribusinesses as well. Now, it first of all starts from the power to know. And having that information at the fingertips is always what drives farmers to actually understand the terrain. And it could be anything. It could be weather information, because we had to deal with farmers who had no clue when there were actually rainfall patterns that were changing, or even where to even have accessible inputs, so to speak. But beyond that, we also realized that there was a need to also begin to look at how farmers could be made entrepreneurs, because it wasn't just enough to give information to farmers and then allow them to grow in their own pace. So in so doing, there are a number of programs that began to be enrolled. One of it is the Grow Ambassador program, which then takes agribusinesses, which are input dealers, off-takers, anyone that works in that space, in order to actually have a franchise shop to be able to have quality inputs, and then also give them access to technology, which is also the Grow application that lets them know the number of people around in a certain area from a 10-mile radius in order to be able to sell to. Now, in so doing, what we did was that as time went by, we noticed that farmers slowly moved away from the point where they, as initially mentioned, would only rely on rain-fed irrigation to point where they could actually now invest in quality inputs, have more sophisticated irrigation systems on their farm, and then grow all year round. But there are actually other inventions that have become also very important. And one of it is that we also see the trend when it comes to artificial intelligence. So one of the major things as a company that we decided to do was, how can farmers also benefit from this? And one of the major ways we did this was that we leveraged on connectivity. So for one of the most recent interventions we have, which is known as the DALI AI, what we do here is that we allow farmers to just call a toll-free number and then interact with a conversational AI, so to speak. right? Now, what we've done here is that we are constantly moving into countries where we actually have MNOs. We recently signed one with the government of Sierra Leone, and we actually have the first Creole AI agronomist, which is spoken by over 7 million people within the country. So farmers call this toll-free number, and then they begin to ask the AI any question with regards to agriculture, and it responds in the local language in which they are asking. We then track things such as sentiment analysis, where we are able to tell some of the emotions that the farmers are feeling on the phone. So if a farmer calls and they are not happy with the responses that are being received, we track things such as the increase in pitch to know whether or not we may need to have to call them back for a human interaction to take place. So these are a few interventions that we've started with. And of course, we know that there's actually room to improve, because every time we have these sort of interventions, we notice that there are more simpler ways to actually communicate to farmers. There are better ways to ensure that farmers have quality inputs, and then most importantly, to also finance them on the last mile radius, right? Thank you.
The future is now. I love it. I absolutely love it. Priscilla, I'm going to put you on the spot somewhat. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't. Let's not be cynical, like Goolam was saying a little earlier on. Renewable energy obviously gives us an opportunity in a way that we haven't seen. I think part of what could be argued has alleviated South Africa's energy crisis, at least the electricity part of it, has been the adoption of solar by both businesses and residents alike throughout the country. There's an opportunity for industry to grow there. What's your response to the 10% tariff that has been slapped on solar imports?
I'm not going to comment on that because I'm pro-industrialization. So I think it's also equally important that we beneficiate our minerals and our resources. I'm not so sure whether the penalty in the system is appropriate, but let me give you a bit of an overview on where we are and where I think South Africa should focus on as far as energy is concerned. I think there's no doubt, even with the slides we've seen earlier on, around the carbon intensity of our continent. Of course, we're still not the major contributor to that, but at the same time, as mentioned earlier on, we have endowments, whether it's solar, sun, water, including our minerals, particularly precious metal group metals that we can actually use to leverage on. So those gives us opportunities to think about pivoting and getting into more cleaner energies. So from that perspective, it will be very challenging for Africa as a region if we leverage these minerals, but we still really focus a lot on importation rather than industrializing and creating small businesses and being able to create certain components in the country. Just give an example. When, as Eskom, they were replaced, the Komati with renewables, we left a number of stranded jobs in that region. But particularly if we then integrated that with a solution to bring manufacturing into the region as well, which are opportunities for the future, we would have created more jobs and create more sustainable livelihoods as we move forward. So we should look at this in an integrated way to say, what is the best mechanism to accelerate Africa's growth and self-dependence, and recognizing that some of the technologies, of course, are still in the global north, and what kind of partnerships do we put in place to be able to ensure that we can actually grow the economy. And in transmission, that's what we are focusing on. So for the next 5 years, we are looking at bringing in 37 gigawatts of renewable energy on stream. We know that is not necessarily going to be creating flexibility for the system operator. At the back of that, we're looking for technologies. We do believe that the region's hydro capacity is an opportunity for us to bring resilience and integrate and improve the reliance and the integrity of the system operator. At the same time, we believe that battery storage is another opportunity into the future. Where's Africa from an innovation perspective? We're looking for entrepreneurs. The cost of battery storage is still extremely high. China is progressing and accelerating innovation and technology. We need to do the same for Africa. And then I've spoken a lot about industrialization. So I keep on saying to the team on our board, it will be sad if we build these lines, upgrade our substations, and create this new energy that is clean, and yet people remain hungry.
It was a cheeky question in part because there is a plethora of solutions that we should be considering as we embark on this path. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen, for example.
I deliberately do not want to answer that, but it's in the mix of solutions.
Yes.
And I do believe that as we think about our energy solutions, we should not be looking at 10, 15, 20 years. In the mix of solutions that our integrated resource plan is outlining, and Africa should look at it holistically, the endowments of the energies that we're looking at, but also how do we ensure that we're creating more and more different options and solutions for us. So for me, where I'm sitting and being at the anchor of driving the hydrogen economy in Southern Africa, I do believe that hydrogen will play a role. But at the same time, there are risks associated with it. So there are certain signposts that we should watch very closely as we progress this, but we should be spearheading that. North Africa has opportunities to probably connect faster, leverage its endowments on both solar and renewables, and be able to import through pipeline into the global markets. But in Southern Africa and other regions where we have similar and competitive endowments compared to other regions and countries like Australia and Chile, we then need to think about what do we do for now so that post-2030, when the cost is more competitive, we can then supply and support that. And part of that is being able to ensure that our hard-to-abate industries, earlier on we were talking about agriculture, we need green ammonia in the future. The region is actually exporting food into some of our trade partners, and climate taxes are going to be real, carbon taxes are going to be real. We are already seeing with cross-border adjustment mechanism. We're not debating the impact of that on Africa. How do we make sure we have a sustainable economy into the future? So green hydrogen can provide green ammonia in a sustainable manner. We can also ensure that our mining, as well as some of our hard-to-abate industries such as petrochemicals, are decarbonized. So those are the opportunities that if we are short-term based, post-2030 or so, we might not have sustainable businesses that we take forward. So we should leverage all of these technologies, watch where cost is going, leverage the curves of the cost that we're seeing in renewables, and then also understanding supply chain, which is becoming more and more of a constraint. What I like about, not necessarily that I'm promoting the war globally, the different wars that you've spoken about, is that most countries are starting to think about diversification of supply. And Africa has a very strong relationship with a lot of the European as well as the US. So how do we leverage that? How do we position ourselves that we could actually transmit our electrons? And the only way to do that is through green hydrogen and green ammonia to those countries, while at the same time decarbonizing our own economy. So in a nutshell, a new technology, especially green hydrogen, but we experience in gray hydrogen. We will be able to shift in blue hydrogen as well, using carbon capture and storage. But in the meantime, let's leapfrog and lead and unlock our renewables and also use our precious metals and take advantage of the challenges that the globe is faced with geopolitics and position ourselves to be a key player.
Yinka, let me pick you up on the point of diversification. We've talked about renewables, but also Goolam presented a number of scenarios in terms of geopolitical uncertainty. We've just come from the COVID-19 pandemic. Any lessons learned there in terms of being agile and being able to help businesses deal with uncertainty?
Thank you very much. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic did some damage to the economies of Africa. Is now not in doubt. It's well documented. In 2019, growth for Africa generally average would be about 2.7%. By 2020, that slumped to minus 2%. And of course, it recovered by 2021 to slightly over 4%. And many argue that it should have been faster growth, but for some of the issues you raised, geopolitical tensions in Ukraine, for example, and Russia, that example has affected supply chains and flow to Africa. We've also seen the debt overhang in some of the countries. I think Goolam gave many evidences of that. Beyond the debt overhang that some of the countries have been dealing with, we've also seen some of the countries, whether it's Angola, whether it's Nigeria, or Kenya trying to restructure their balance sheet and fiscal reforms. Some of those activities have then led to, in some instances, social tension. And therefore, as businesses across Africa, we've had to grapple with these things. Yet, Africa, as you could see on some of the group projections that Goolam showed, we're still going to grow at over 4% or around 4%. So, all in all, it is resilience I see. And as Standard Bank, we see opportunities, therefore, to support our clients to navigate these challenges and to ensure that they can keep their businesses going, they can keep our people employed, and then they can contribute their quota to the growth of Africa in the medium to the long term.
Would you say that there are particular countries or even regions that show potential for expansion, and what would underpin that assessment?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, this is why I like to be on a panel with Goolam. I think he provided all the evidence, apart from the fact that our chief executive the other day thought I was now dressing like 3 pieces of suit and things like that, pinstripe suits. But the regions, I think from the evidence, a key region, we're very, very excited about East Africa. I think the East Africa region is projected and is growing at in excess of 5%. So from Ethiopia to Kenya to Uganda and Tanzania, those are countries that are growing at very, very quick pace, excess of 5%. If you leave East Africa and you come to the West, we also see bright spots. Examples will be Côte d'Ivoire, will be Senegal, that are also growing at high single digits. And of course, DRC, I mentioned DRC earlier. So from the east to the west and some part of Central Africa, we see countries growing, outpacing the growth, global growth. And you asked about what sectors. The sectors that we've seen opportunities and growth will include agriculture, hence we have him on the panel. What other evidence do you need? And he's also told us about the future of agriculture, AI, and things like that. Besides agriculture, we see investments huge in infrastructure. In fact, the African Development Bank references that for the next couple of years, Africa would require about $130 to $170 billion of investment in infrastructure. And Africa is attracting some of that. So besides agriculture, besides infrastructure, we also see investment and opportunities in energy. Again, the evidence is here, where Africa is having to invest in energy so that we can harness the resources that we have. Fourthly, there is mining related to energy. So there are countries that sector has become very critical to. And if I would put a last one, specifically in East Africa, I know he tried to, and Lungisa, my colleague, tried to make a case for tourism here. There's also a positive impact of tourism in East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania. So these are some of the sectors that are driving or underpinning the growth that we've seen across Africa.
Goolam, of course, we're not alone in the world. You mentioned the rise of big men politics in the rest of the world in the examples that you outlined. And are you encouraged at all, or what do you make of what appears to at least be a swing to the left in the UK and France just in the last couple of weeks? And how does Africa respond to all of these dynamics that are unfolding, with still some much uncertainty, I think, to come?
Bongani, so there's heightened levels of multipolarity where Africa can play an amplified role in global geopolitics. What do I mean by that? So China was quite visionary more than 25 years ago, when it considered that while Africa had 54 states generating only 3% of global GDP, however, those 54 states could generate a great deal of political heft, lending itself to the China agenda, for example, in matters of climate change. And so China established the FOCAC Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, so as to politically embrace African economies, African nations, African leaders. And that gave China enormous economic diplomacy leverage on the continent. Simultaneously, the United States gave up a great deal of ground with the absence of economic diplomacy, with a situation where once upon a time its president referred to a certain African country as Nambia rather than Namibia. And it just spoke to the detachment.
And that was just a polite example, right?
It was a polite
You
example.
can think of another one or two.
The profanities as well. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that Africa is back on the global agenda because America realized it gave up a significant foothold to the East. The global South is a force to be reckoned with. BRICS has morphed into BRICS Plus. The end of American empire may only be 10 years away. And so America is refashioning its relationships politically with the continent, not just using its big firms to be its reflections of presence on the continent. And I think that then says Africa must not be short-sighted in choosing East or West. And it's not to suggest we forego our morals, our principles, our historical leanings and learnings, but to be able to appreciate that pools of capital still emanate largely from the West. New markets are in the East. Quicker growth in per capita consumption is going to be in the East. But rich consumption is still in the West in terms of per capita dominance. The US at above $45 per person. Europe still significant. So I think a multi-nation approach, but harnessing this geopolitical fragmentation to penetrate markets, to bypass what was once called the Brussels effect, in other words, where Brussels would script laws under the guise of modernity, but shielding African agriculture from penetrating the European markets, now using that leverage. And I think African markets must assemble around regions, because I don't think we're going to do it as a single Pan-African force, the way the African Free Trade Agreement has shown we can come together, but perhaps in regions where we're able to penetrate those markets premised on this yearn and need for legitimacy of those foreign nations through African eyes.
Priscilla, I can mention any number of challenges around renewables, all the things that have been outlined by Goolam. But in a sense, the formation of the National Transmission Company of South Africa is a response to what we have dealt with here in South Africa. And perhaps as your closing comment, can you talk to me about the kind of agility business needs to think about on the continent in terms of coming up with new solutions to old problems?
Thank you. I think it's also important that as we think about positivity, we just realized as a board, we started in February, and we've already managed within a very short period of time to operationalize NTSA. It's not by any imagination that we are underestimating the task that we have ahead of us in terms of not only delivering the infrastructure required, but also ensuring that we stimulate economic growth and regional integration. So it's a huge task on all of us, but we are set up for it in the next 5 years. I think for me, it's great to have these platforms, but when I meet with banks, I always challenge them because it looks like from banking institutions, sorry, Sim, you have a standard model that you pull from your archives in terms of funding. So I do believe that the challenges that South Africa and the region and the continent is facing requires innovation and different solutions. Partnerships need to be strengthened even further, in terms of looking at different funding solutions, funding models, because cost of funding will continuously disadvantage Africa as a whole from a competitiveness. And at times it does pain me to see that the risk premium is also attached by our own local banks as well. So how do we think differently around reducing the cost of funding is a big issue. I do believe that we need to harness and drive and accelerate the entrepreneurship and innovation of our region. At times I go to conferences, I get really blown up with West Africa and East Africa's innovation, and yet we are not necessarily bringing those technologies and accelerating and developing them into real solutions like countries like China, Asia, India that are actually accelerating this. So innovation is going to be quite important to unlock the different technologies that we're seeing and being able to address the unemployment rate of 60% in South Africa and other markets around Africa. A third element is around how do we ensure that as big, small businesses, we stop looking for perfect policies, implementation at scale, and I think new entrepreneurs and the emerging and existing ones will play a critical role in the supply chain, the industrialization. We really want to ensure that we can be so proud after 5 years in transmission to say we've created these new businesses that are going to be the heart of the economy going forward, whether it's components or whether it's manufacturing in various aspects of the equipments that we will be looking for. And I think lastly, linked again to the whole issue about farming, we have to have integrated supply chains. Listening to food security is a critical element for the region, but at the same time, sustainable fuels is also an integral part, and we have advantages as a region. So when I look at all of Asia, and I'm saying, why are certain geographies like South America advanced so much on sustainable fuels and sustainable solutions, and yet we have all of the endowments, we've got the land, we've got the water in some areas. How do we harness that to decarbonize, pivot, and lead in terms of really ensuring that we can unlock sustainable growth for the region?
Marvin, I'll let you pick up on that in terms of sustainable food production systems and the opportunities. You've already mentioned some fantastic innovations as far as using technology is concerned, but how do we leverage on what has already been started?
Right, okay. So as part of sustainable agriculture, one of the major things that we believe has now become an important topic is what climate change is also bringing to the table. When you look at the current trends, we notice that farmers need to be trained on how to be climate resilient. And we are leveraging on technology to do this because we notice that it is important for them to, first of all, as mentioned, understand what it takes to be resilient. Now, leveraging on this, what we've seen is that in terms of the current trends, we notice that majority of it actually goes into farmers understanding the mitigation measures that are in place and that could be made to make them more sustainable in terms of their production. And one major part of it is, first of all, having to incorporate things such as agroforestry into their farming practices. And even beyond that, also having to also leverage on technology to push certain aspects such as solar irrigation and also drought-resistant seeds. Now, all these are actually shaping agriculture on the continent at the moment, and we see farmers more and more understanding what it takes. We also understand that about 80% of agricultural land expansion leads to deforestation. And if you look at the recent regulations that are coming in place from the European Union with regards to the deforestation and also in other parts, we notice that it is important to constantly train and reinvent to make sure that farmers actually stay ahead of the conversation. This is because it needs to be now, and there's no other time to do that. The kind of policies that are being made, farmers need to be put at the forefront because we can have all the discussions, and yet still farmers still have no clue on where to even start from, how to even begin to be sustainable in terms of their production. And that is why at the beginning I did mention that technology has a major role to play, and in so doing, it's not just enough to have technology, but also to make it accessible. And in so doing, we are leveraging on other aspects such as even the community-based advisors, because let me give you an idea of what happens. Now, you have a technology where you are able to reach farmers in certain locations, but mind you, for the terrain in which we find ourselves in, most farmers find themselves in very remote locations. So irrespective of the technology you have, you would notice that at some point in time, certain farmers are cut off from being able to access information and being able to then leverage on actionable items. Now, how do we do this? We notice there's a need to still depend on the traditional way to actually go into communities, train farmers who could actually have very little skills in operating mobile devices in order for them to be some bit of advisory services to other farmers. And in so doing, we leverage on a model known as the community-based advisors model, where certain farmers within communities are trained to become advisors within there. And in so doing, they then are or become the focal point of all information that is being sent out. So they have the technology that it takes to be able to map, to be able to pick GPS coordinates of plots, to be able to onboard farming communities onto the global market. And this is actually causing a bit of linkage beyond our expectation. And it's even getting even better because now we're even leveraging on the village-based advisors as well to equally advise farmers on that level. So it's a 360 approach. It's not just about technology. It's also leveraging on individuals to understand what it takes to be resilient. Yeah.
Yinka, perhaps you can also respond to one of Priscilla's parting shots around funding flexibility. All of these problems, all of these innovations are going to need the bank's support.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't disagree with Priscilla. We have to be innovative. We have to find the courage to back the businesses here and around Africa if we're going to achieve the objectives. And so therefore, for Standard Bank, part of the benefit of this kind of forum is exactly that, where we can bring clients together, they can network and see what opportunities exist. Earlier on in the morning, I met one of our clients from Botswana, Boso University, operating in 5 countries. They just opened a university in Accra. Meeting him, the client, quickly tells me that perhaps we are able to link him with the opportunities that exist in East Africa. We have a client in East Africa that just secured funding from the US, MIDA, to build student accommodation. So if he's starting a university in Ghana, clearly the students will need accommodation. So I'm agreeing with you that we are trying our best, and definitely we can do more. But beyond Standard Bank, I think also, even at regional level, so your experience, for instance, Priscilla, in transmission, I'm asking myself, can Nigeria learn from it? I think the answer must be yes. I mean, that country has been battling for many years to get it right. So the point I'm making is that we, Standard Bank, we see ourselves as facilitators, not just of thought leadership of the type that Goolam gave us this morning, world class, first class, global standard. But we can also go beyond thought leadership and ensure that we do it does real stuff, but we do real things that you expect as clients. Put our money, our wallet, where our mouth is, by backing your ambitions. Thirdly and lastly, let me say, part of what we should also do, which I'm sure Bill agrees, is how do we connect these businesses represented here to the various value chains? So there might be a huge gas project in Mozambique, or in Uganda, or in Tanzania, or in Angola, very top end. But clearly there's midstream, there is downstream. So what we should do, what we're trying to do, is to identify those clients that will be part of those value chains, and then give them the access. We have access to all this knowledge, and then write the check. Of course, we have different people in the bank that do that. So whilst I can be here as a spokesperson, our credit people will need to be satisfied and ensure that we can back the ideas. But definitely, certainly.
And that's where the template comes out. Goolam, perhaps you'll have the last word on this. Simple question. Are you an optimist about Africa?
3.5% to 4.5%. What I mean by that is we suspect that the continent will be able to muster that steady state level of growth into 2030. That supersedes population growth by about 1.5 percentage points. We suggest that per capita income growth is positive, firstly. And perhaps that's a halo statement that endorses my optimism. Second, economic diplomacy. It's very powerful in buttressing local industry. It helped China when it embraced Africa in lifting China's exports to the continent from $30 billion to in excess of $550 billion. It similarly helped Brazil. Many people are unaware, for example, something about presidents being president and then going to prison. But prior to going to prison, President Lula, in his first stint as president, visited Africa 6 times before his first official visit to Europe. And in his first visit, he went to the island of Gore of Senegal, where he apologized for Brazil's complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. But my point being, that endeavor helped Brazil go from $3 billion to $30 billion. So economic diplomacy, we need to encourage our politicians to take us along as business people, as bankers, and forge those new Global South links, for example. Third, technology. Telemedicine, teleeducation, powerful in boosting African healthcare, the health of an African child and the educational levels of African children. It's the great leveler. The only real restriction for African learning has been the price of hardware, but it's plunged to roughly a tenth of what it would be, less than a tenth of what it would be 40 years ago, for example. So the under $100 tablet, the inexpensive smartphone, not iPhone, Chinese brands, for example, is effectively putting that hardware in the hands of Africans to be able to then get access to these global learnings. So I think that's going to be tectonic, and I